Hello and welcome back to the podcast. In today's episode, I am bringing you a long-awaited episode, which is my own birth story for my daughter. I know some of you have been waiting for it for a little bit, and I have been telling you that I was going to record it. So here it is. In this episode, I am taking you through our conception journey to conceive our daughter, which, trigger warning, I had a miscarriage. So we had a first pregnancy, which resulted in a miscarriage, and then we conceived. And I'm taking you through trying to navigate not knowing my cycles and trying to conceive, and therefore not being successful for about 10 months. And then once we did get pregnant, navigating the system, again, not knowing my options and relying on my GP to help guide me. As an exercise physiologist, I'm also letting you in on my biases and how they influenced my pregnancy and labor and postpartum journey, and how it effectively led me to using the BRAIN acronym to determine my choices, but also advocate for those choices and be heard by the system. Finally, I am taking you through my rather, I think, fast birth story for my daughter, and how I was in complete denial of even being in labor, but also how different my expectations of pre-labor were to what the reality actually was, and how much of a shock that was to me. So I won't tell you anything more, and I will leave you with the episode, and hopefully you enjoy it. You are listening to Kappa with a Doula. I'm your host, Alicia, exercise physiologist and doula, and every week I chat with a mum or mum-to-be about all things pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. The stories you will hear in this podcast are real and sometimes raw, but they are all told without any taboo. So grab yourself a cuppa, put your earphones in, relax, and enjoy this episode. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. So today I will be both the guest and the interviewer at the same time, because I will be telling you my own birth story for my daughter. So I will try and answer the questions like I ask them to my guests. I'll try and keep the podcast style the same, and let's just dive into it. So to introduce myself, to anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Alicia. I am an exercise physiologist and a doula. I'm also the interviewer behind this podcast, in case you didn't know. In my family, there is myself, my partner Jason, and we have a daughter, and I'm currently 31 weeks pregnant at the time of this recording. We do not know the gender of this upcoming baby, so I can't tell you if we're having a boy or a girl. One of my favorite questions, and that's the one I try and always start the podcast with, is whether the guest always wanted to be a mom or not. And I think that's a really interesting question, so I love asking it at the start. In my case, did I always want to be a mom? The answer is, I think, like most of my guests, some of them it's a straight yes, others it's a straight no. And for the majority of people, I feel it's I never really thought of it. So I feel like I fit in that I never really thought of it category. So for me, I didn't really think of it until I was 18. So when I was 18, I actually left home, and I came to Australia actually, and I became an au pair. So sort of like a nanny, but that lives at basically the children's home that you're looking after. And I think from there on, so I think I was maybe about 6 months into my au pair journey, and that's when I really started to contemplate whether I wanted kids or not. I think before then, it was kind of I want to say it was sort of like a societal norm that to me it was pretty much accepted that because I was a heterosexual female, that I would find a partner at some point and I would have children. And I didn't really think of it. I didn't even think or start to consider whether that was actually something I wanted. I felt like that's what you do. So when I was a nanny, and therefore I was actually looking after two children. So they were at the time, they were school age children. And so what I was responsible for was getting them ready in the morning. So getting their breakfast ready, getting them dressed for school, taking them to school, and then picking them up from school, doing homework if they had any, keeping them entertained, and then potentially making dinner. And so I think through that experience, it showed me a side of motherhood in a sense. Obviously, those were primary school age children, they were not babies. So obviously, skipped a lot of years there. But it gave me a sense of what it was like to be essentially almost like a stay at home mum, basically. Because of that experience, it really got me thinking. And I went, actually, I do want to have children. This is something I want. So from there on, I knew that I wanted children, and it wasn't just society telling me to have children or society telling me that it was, acceptable to have children after you found your partner and so on. I think that's really when I decided that I wanted to be a mum. I wasn't really hang up on the number. I was just thinking, I definitely want to be a mum one day. But to me, I wanted to be a mom after I finished my studies and after I found a job or I had what I considered to be a stable position. So both in terms of financial position, but also in terms of housing. So having a stable home and having an income of sorts. When it came to meeting Jason, so we met at uni actually. So we're both exercise physiologists. We met during our studies. It's extremely boring because we do the exact same job, basically. No, I'm kidding. It's really cool, actually. So we're both exercise physiologists. That's how we met. The topic of having children actually came up fairly quickly, I think, in our relationship. And I think I was the one that initiated the conversation because I wanted to be clear, I think, and I wanted to put it on the table that my long-term plan was to find someone to have children with, and I didn't want to be with someone who wasn't keen on having children ever. And to me, that would have been a deal breaker. So I think that's why I started the conversation early in our relationship, knowing that I didn't want children right then and there, but it was on my cards for the future, definitely for me. And so then when it came the time to conceive, so we had both graduated from uni, we had both gotten a job, and we were in the process of buying a home, actually, or we were starting to consider buying a house. So we were doing all the, going to the bank and asking for mortgages and so on, and then starting the search. So we were in that type of process, basically. One thing that I found really interesting is for all the years that I've been sexually active, it was all about never getting pregnant. So it was always like, and I think this is a common theme amongst at least us women, we're told from the get-go that it only takes one time for you to get pregnant if you're not using any sort of protection. And so all these years, it's been about not falling pregnant. And then when we decided with Jason to have children, so therefore, we remove contraception, it didn't happen straight away. And that was really a shock because for all these years, I thought if at any point we remove contraception, well, surely I'm going to fall pregnant because that's what society's been telling me all these years. And then we intentionally want to fall pregnant and nothing happened. That was extremely frustrating, and it was really hard to adapt to that concept and to really accept it. The other thing was, I wasn't on contraception. I haven't been on the pill for many, many, many years because I got a lot of side effects from the pill, actually, and I tried two different types. Both were the mini pill, so with the minimum amount of hormones, and I reacted to both really badly. So I haven't been on contraception for a long, long time. And so even despite that, I don't think I knew my cycles and I understood what happened. It sounds really silly to say that, right? Because obviously I know what my periods are and I know what it means, but I don't think I understood what ovulation was and what how it manifested in my body. So up until we started to want to conceive, I don't think I actually really paid attention to, the ovulation part of my cycle and what symptoms I was getting either before or even straight after ovulation. So therefore, when it came time to conceive, I actually had no idea when was the correct time or when was the most optimal time to actually have intercourse. That was quite interesting because so when we started trying to conceive, for more than a few months, for probably about 6 months, it was like, oh, maybe it's just normal because, well, who knows, right? I mean, they do say that the average healthy couple takes about 10 to 12 months to conceive, right? But after 6 months of nothing happening, I was kind of worried, really. And I was kind of thinking, well, surely there's a problem. And to me, the problem it had to be from me, obviously. Even though we know that when trying to conceive in this journey, there's two parties, there's male and female, and the problem can be from either side or from both. Or there could be no problem as well. But anyway, in my mind, after 6 months of trying and nothing happening, I thought I had a problem. So then I started looking, I was tracking my period using an app. And so I started looking at that app and looking at when it said I would be ovulating. And so therefore we started timing the intercourse that way, which kind of became a chore really at this point for us after 6 months of nothing happening when we really wanted it to happen then having to sort of time intercourse, so to speak, it kind of became a bit of a chore, really. Like it took a bit of the fun out of the equation, really. But anyway, we did it. And so it still wasn't happening. And so that's when I actually purchased ovulation kits and I did those. And I realized that actually I wasn't ovulating on day 15 or 16 like my app was saying. I was actually ovulating before. But again, I wasn't in tune enough with my body. I don't think I was looking enough for those cues, those really subtle, for some people it's subtle symptoms, for others it's really obvious symptoms, and for me it was quite subtle, and so therefore I was it kind of really sounds silly saying that on the podcast, but yeah, I had no idea about when I was ovulating, so therefore I don't think we were timing intercourse really well, and so therefore we were not conceiving. Who knows? I mean, obviously, we know that it takes between 10 and 12 months to conceive for a healthy couple. So even when you time it well, you could still not conceive for a number of reasons. But so anyway, after all this time, so at that point, it had been 9 months of trying to conceive and still nothing, right? And then on the ninth month of trying to conceive, I forgot to add, but I was doing pretty much pregnancy tests, I think pretty much every month. Unless my period came early, but I tried to do the test before my period anyway, like a day or two before. So I was kind of cheating anyway. And so pretty much every month I was doing a pregnancy test and it was negative, right? Like there was nothing. I was even doing holding the pregnancy test to the light or seeing with the flash if there was if there was a line that was hidden. There was no line there, okay? Like there was nothing. But I was so hopeful. Okay. Anyway, I was getting disappointed every month. On the ninth month, we got a positive pregnancy test. So I was actually pregnant. That was insane. I had never seen a line on a pregnancy test before, right? So I was like, wow. And it was so faint. It was actually it wasn't a strong line. I mean, it was there. Like I didn't have to use the flash or hold the test to the light to see it. It was faint. And I mean, I think I tested maybe 2 days before my period as well. So, it was quite early days as well. So anyway, so on the ninth month, we conceived. We were beyond thrilled. It finally happened. It was almost a shock at this point because it had taken us 9 months. So it was almost like, oh, what? It worked. Wow. Okay. And then from there on, we're like, oh, okay, what do we do now? It was all like, not panic, but it was all like so surprising, even though we had been trying intentionally for 9 months. And unfortunately, that pregnancy ended up in a miscarriage. So I lost a pregnancy at about 6 to 7 weeks. One day I felt really off on one of those days. So I wasn't getting morning sickness much at that point. I don't even think I had nausea at that point. I had maybe some bloating. But one morning, it was a Saturday, and I woke up and I just felt just felt off. Like I woke up and I was really, really tired, and something didn't feel right. And so I rested for that morning. I watched TV, and then I remember feeling like there was blood. So I went to check, and there was blood, and it wasn't just a little bit. It was pretty much like my period came. So we went to the hospital. I didn't want to go personally because I kind of gathered what was happening, and I kind of knew that there wouldn't be much that could be done at that point. I did maybe hope that they could give me maybe some progesterone or something. But anyway, we went to the ED, and the doctor there was actually really good, and he was really kind, because I feel like this can be a really difficult place for some people. So for us, it took us 9 months to conceive. That was our first pregnancy, and we basically lost the pregnancy like the next week. It was devastating. We were devastated. And I know that some doctors, maybe they think, oh, look, you were not even that far along. We hadn't had a scan yet, right? Like I had literally just confirmed the pregnancy with a blood test. And I think I had booked in for a dating scan, but that was maybe the week after, or, soon after that. And so we hadn't had any scans yet. And yeah, we lost a pregnancy, and that was devastating. And I'm remembering it, and it's really sad. It was a difficult time. And I remember just when we got home, and after a few days, I was on a mission to get pregnant. I just wanted to be pregnant because it took us 9 months to get there. And I was thinking, it's going to take us another 9 months to get pregnant again. It's so long. It was just so hard. And then we got pregnant the next month. That was insane. So what happened is I basically passed the miscarriage naturally. I didn't need any help. I got a scan done a few days later, and they said that everything was gone, basically. And so from there on, no one really said anything about needing to wait between pregnancies. As I said, for me, I just really wanted to be pregnant. It had taken us so long to get there, and that was something we really wanted. Yeah, I just didn't want to wait. So then we continued, because basically at that point, that was sort of like a reset. So it was like I had my period. So I went back to ovulation tests, because at that point I was doing the ovulation tests every month. So I did the ovulation tests, and I remember I started them early because I was still trying to find the exact window that my ovulation was on. So I did them, right? And I was using the ones with the little smiley face, and I never got an ovulation. According to those tests, which I was doing, just like the instructions said, starting early, like before you think that you're ovulating. And then I was seeing that the smiley face was changing towards ovulation, but it never got to the ovulation smiley face. So in this cycle, to me, I never ovulated, right? We still had intercourse, but I never ovulated. So I'm like, okay, well, that's another month gone. Okay, cool. And so then came the time for my period. And so at that point, I knew the symptoms I would get before my period, right? And I wasn't getting any of them like a few days before my period. So I'm thinking, okay, this is all strange. And because I just had the miscarriage, I'm thinking this has probably thrown my whole cycle out of whack. And now my body is really confused. So I don't think anything of it. But then at some point I do a pregnancy test, because I'm thinking, okay, what are the chances, right? So I do a pregnancy test. It's 100% positive. There's definitely a line there. And I'm thinking, oh, wow. And I knew it wasn't remnants from the previous pregnancy, because I had been doing pregnancy tests after we had the miscarriage, and those were negative. So I knew it wasn't, my HCG level had gone back to 0. And so therefore I was like, oh, what? that was totally unexpected. So on the 10th month of trying to conceive, we actually conceived, and that was a different level of shock, because even though I was on a mission of trying to get pregnant again, when it actually happened again, I thought, oh no, I should have waited now. I shouldn't have gotten pregnant straight away. I'm definitely going to have a miscarriage again now. So I had this whole anxiety of it's happened too soon. Surely my body is just gonna reject it, and I'm going to have another miscarriage. And the thing is, I did think to myself after the miscarriage, I thought, well, I really want to get pregnant. I really wanted to be a mom, definitely. But it put a lot of things in perspective, and I had to accept that by trying to get pregnant and trying to conceive, I was accepting pregnancy in whatever form it would take, which included miscarriages, which before my miscarriage, I never considered that. So to me, before my miscarriage, I think I had heard of miscarriages and I knew what they were blurrily. So the concept wasn't really clear, let's say. Because I feel like you can know what something is, but until you've experienced it, you don't really understand the depth of it, right? And I know I'm talking about it like potentially like I had a miscarriage way further down the track, but for me, I felt absolutely devastated after that miscarriage. And I think we need to normalize saying it, because it's not, oh, well, at least you were early. This was our baby. We had already planned a lot of things, right? We projected ourselves being parents. We could see it. We had an estimated due date and so on, and we knew that, in October we'd be parents and so on. And when it didn't happen, that was crushing, devastating. It was so sad. So I know that some people might think, oh yeah, but you were only 7 weeks. Yes, but it's all the idea and the projections that just got shattered. And I obviously, no one knew that I was going to get pregnant the next month. But even then, it's not the same. You've always, I've had 3 pregnancies. I didn't have 2. I've had 3 pregnancies. This is part of my pregnancy journey. It's not just, oh, let's discard it because, that baby didn't come in the world. It happened. So anyway, so on the 10th month, we conceived, and there was obviously a lot of anxiety there from the miscarriage. And so therefore, it was a very difficult first trimester, because I was so sure anytime I cramped, anytime there was a twinge, anytime I didn't have morning sickness, anytime I didn't feel sick, anytime I didn't feel tired, I was so sure that something had happened. And I didn't get morning sickness. I had a little bit of nausea. It was mostly afternoons, actually, like towards the later part of the afternoon, that I would get sometimes nausea. I got really tired, but I never vomited, actually, so that was good. But therefore, for me, because you hear everywhere that when you're pregnant you're just going to vomit a lot in the first trimester, well, when I didn't, well, obviously there was a problem there. So that was a problem for me. That's basically my journey into conceiving our daughter. So in terms of the pregnancy, so we did a dating scan. And when we got to the dating scan, that was a huge milestone for us. And it was so good. It was so, so good to see the baby's heartbeat, to see that it was tiny, really. It was a teeny tiny thing, but it was so good to see. I loved scans in this pregnancy because it was just so reassuring after having a miscarriage, after having a loss, to just see the baby, to see the baby's heartbeat, to hear it, to see the baby move. It was great. I loved it. In terms of models of care, so I did not know anything about models of care. I don't think I knew any options, really. I knew the hospitals we had around us. To me, having a hospital birth was a no-brainer because, again, society, because, well, my mom gave birth in a hospital, so to me it made sense for me to give birth in a hospital. It was almost what I expected to do, so I don't even think I thought of a home birth. And I think when I started thinking of potentially having a home birth, to me, I thought, I can't do it for my first. I'd have to see how my first labor goes to potentially, if we want to have a second child, to potentially have a home birth then, if that's something we want. Again, that's all basically my thoughts. You got to do what works for you. And for me, the hospital ended up working out pretty good. So I went to my GP, we confirmed the pregnancy, we got the dating scan, and then from there on, I was lucky that I had a GP who actually knew about options and could actually tell me what options I had. So he actually referred me to the midwifery group practice at my local hospital. And I think at that point I was 12 weeks because I had had my first trimester scan. I think I got really lucky to get in because, well, like you've probably heard stories of women that just don't get into their MGP even when they've sent the referral really early on. So anyway, so somehow I got really lucky. I got into the midwifery group practice, and I didn't know much about what it was, but I understood that you'd have the same midwife, and that at that point I had started to do a bit of research. I was on, Facebook groups, I was on different pregnancy communities, I was starting to listen. I had been listening to birth and pregnancy podcast, I think, since before we started to conceive. So I had a little bit of education from that. Now that, I was pregnant, it was obviously a whole different understanding of it, right? Like things were put into a different perspective. So then I got referred to the MGP at my local hospital. That was an interesting experience because during the first trimester, I felt really lost in the system. So I felt like unless there was a major problem, I didn't have anyone to ask or reach out to. I couldn't ask questions because I didn't have my midwife yet. She hadn't been assigned to me somehow. My GP could only really answer questions or refer me if I had, if I was sick or if there was anything concerning regarding the pregnancy, but he wasn't there to answer questions around like anything, birth related and general pregnancy related, right? And so therefore I felt really lost. I felt like there was just no one to turn to. I think I was 16 weeks when I first had a phone call with my midwife. So I didn't even meet her first. We did a phone call and basically an intake. And even then it felt very medical. So it was all about, my medical history. It was all about, getting forms and questionnaires sorted. But it wasn't about, she did say, do you have questions? It just didn't feel like I had the space to ask questions yet. So then I had to wait until I actually met her, and I was lucky that she would come to my house and we'd do the appointments there. And she was quite good in that she wouldn't rush me. Like she wouldn't say, "Oh, look, I'm on the clock. I've kind of got things to do." So she would take the time. I think all I want to say with this is I felt in the first and the early second trimester, it was all a bit like I was left to my own device, really. So I wanted information. I wanted education. I wanted stuff. I wanted to know stuff. I wanted to know a lot of things, right? And I didn't know how to prepare for birth, right? Like, first time mom, I had been listening to podcasts, but when it came to my own birth, I'm like, well, where do I start? Like I had been listening to all these podcasts about women that said, this is how I want my birth to be and this is what I want. And I was like, but how do they come to that conclusion? Like, how do they know what options is, how do they know what they want? So I had to do a lot of research, right? So the way I did my research is I read a lot. So instead of just Googling stuff, I went on government websites. So I checked out, I was in Queensland, so I checked out, Queensland Health. I checked out their guidelines. They've usually got, I think they have a pregnancy, baby and mom like PDF. So I read that. And then from there on, it basically opened doors for questions. So therefore I would read something and I would go, oh, that would be a great thing to discuss with my midwife, or that would be a great thing for me to dive deeper into. So then I actually started researching based on that. So there would be little things that would lead me to then research further into. And so that's actually how I ended up educating myself, really. I also read books. I borrowed some from the library, and podcasts were my main education, really. I also did a online hypnobirthing course, which was excellent. It was all video based and you could watch them as many times as you wanted, and they were quite short. So therefore it was really good to talk about basically breathing techniques, relaxation methods, what happens during birth, the physiology behind, the uterus, the hormones and so on, right? And the different stages of birth and so on. So between that hypnobirthing course and podcasts mainly, I thought I had a pretty good picture, let's say, or at least a picture in my mind of what birth could look like. And I think, like I said in my pregnancy series, the part 2, I think, so at that point, that's when I started to decide what I wanted for my birth, or how I wanted my birth to be, in as much as I know that birth isn't predictable and I knew that I had to stay flexible, but I had, let's say, preferences of what I wanted and then what I didn't want. One of the things that I didn't know And I only understood that later when I took a big step back into motherhood, and when I started this podcast is when I realized that one of the things I was doing, because I am an allied health professional, in our studies we've actually been taught to research and to question. And so therefore, when it came to, my pregnancy journey, I would question things. So when I was told, for example, if at 40 plus 5 you haven't given birth, we'll start talking about an induction, I would question that, and I would say, well, why 40 plus 5? That's a very specific number. Why 40 plus 5? Because I've read at other hospitals that they go to 41 plus 5. So why 40 plus 5 then? I always had this, no, I didn't always have it. I think there was a point in my degree where I realized that health professionals are just people. Because, well, I'm a health professional, I'm an allied health professional, and I'm just a person, right? And I realize that they're just people, and sometimes they can make mistakes, right? So, for example, GPs, doctors, obstetricians, they're people, right? So sometimes the advice they give you can be outdated, or it can be in total disagreement with what you'd like to do. And that's fine. You can tell them that this is not something you want to do, right? But somehow society tells us that if we're given medical advice, we have to follow it. And that's not necessarily true. We don't have to blindly follow medical advice. We can ask questions. We can ask about, alternatives. We can ask about, why is that the best option for me? What are the risks if I don't do it? What are the risks, of me doing this? And this now might sound like the brain acronym to you: benefits, risk, alternative, intuition, nothing. So I have been doing that before I even knew what the brain acronym was. So when it came to my pregnancy, that's what I was doing. So I was questioning my midwife, which was probably really annoying for her, because I'd be like, yeah, okay, but why? Or I would say, well, I'm not doing that. Like, she would say, oh, this is how we do it. And I'd be like, okay, well, cool, but I'm not doing it, Or if she happened to say something like, generally we do this, I'd be like, okay, well, that's in general. So what do you do for people like me that don't want to do what is generally done? And so therefore, I was probably the biggest pain in her bum, really. But I was questioning, and I can tell you, you need to question, because it opened doors. So all of a sudden, and I didn't get that far, right? But I was told that I would basically have the induction talk at 40 plus 5. But then I said, yeah, but why 40 plus 5? And so all of a sudden, this date got moved back to 41 plus 6. And I was like, well, that's great for me. If I still haven't given birth at 41 plus however many days, I'm potentially pushing back an induction. Good. But when I was thinking about it, I was thinking, but what about all the other women that don't ask questions because they don't know to ask questions? That's not fair. Because if you're telling one person 40 plus 5, but you're telling another person 41 plus 6, that's not fair on the person that's getting induced at 40 plus 5, because it's a number. That is not fair. And so I think that's when I started to consider that, like, I was doing something right by questioning, and it was opening different doors. But then I was thinking about all the other women that don't question, and those doors don't open for them. And that was making me really sad, actually. And so anyway, all of that rant to say, ask questions, say why, say what happens if I do this, what happens if I don't do this, what happens if I do nothing. I love this question of what happens if I do nothing. I find this is the best question ever, because usually when medical professionals give you their professional advice, they want you to do something with it. So they want you to take action. So when you say, what happens if I do nothing? They kind of go, well, let me think about this. And that's when they come up with alternatives, actually. So when you ask the nothing question, you're usually getting alternatives actually set to you. So I find this is a great question to ask, just as a side note. So anyway, back to my story. So I asked my midwife a lot of questions. So I was lucky, again, the right place, the right time. I was really lucky that I had my own midwife. It would be the same midwife every time. She would come to see me in my home and we'd do the visits there, and I could ask questions. I never felt like she was on the clock, and I never felt like she was trying to rush through things. So that was good. I always felt like I had time to ask her questions, and obviously building rapport was really essential at that point because, well, something I didn't consider is at that point I'm thinking, well, that's great. I'm seeing the same midwife. She will be at my birth. I never considered that I'm seeing the same midwife. She could not be at my birth because she could be at someone else's birth, or she could be not on call because she's just attended a birth. I never considered that at any point. And so therefore, if that had been the case, I would have had a very unknown midwife because she was the only one I had ever seen. And so therefore, I would have had a totally unknown midwife at my birth. So therefore, building rapport there would have been totally useless. In terms of birth preferences, when it came to basically imagining my birth, so I'm a very visual person. So for me, when it came to, I did the hypnobirthing course, and they obviously talk about birth preferences and trying to visualize and trying to imagine your birth. That was so aligned with me. To be fully prepared, I had to see the space. I went to hospital at some point and I asked to see the room, one of the birthing suites, so that I could actually visualize the space, because I knew that I wanted to stay at home for as much of my labor as I could, but then I would go to hospital. And in my preparation, if I didn't know what the suite looked like or what it could, semi look like, I couldn't imagine anything, right? So at some point I got a tour of the suite that was basically opening one door, showing me what the suite looks like. Perfect. And I got to see also what equipment they had. Well, I shouldn't say equipment. I sound like an EP right now. What birth accessories, props they had, which basically, interesting thing actually, side note. So as an exercise physiologist in that pregnancy, I was really active. So I knew what I wanted to do in terms of my health, and I knew how to stay strong and how to try and avoid a lot of pregnancy aches like hip pain, pubic symphysis pain, back pain, and so on, right? So I was doing a lot of walking and I was doing strength training in a manner that was safe and appropriate for my body and my physical condition. When it came to the third trimester, it was really interesting because I had been quite conservative with obviously the loading. And in the third trimester, what was really funny is I got restricted by my belly. So that was really funny because I was doing deadlifts and then I was like, oh, I can't bend any further because I feel like I'm squashing myself. So, which is something like, even though I had the theory in my head of, what to do and regressing the exercises and dropping weights. And I knew that in the third trimester, you can get restricted. I don't think I ever considered the belly as a restriction somehow. So I found it really funny when it happened to me. And I was like, there's something in the way there. That's funny. So it gave me a deeper understanding of what it's like to exercise during both obviously pregnancy and then during the postpartum period as well. So all of that to say, I obviously exercised quite religiously almost. I was probably almost more regular in my exercise training then than I had been before, because all of a sudden it was like, I need to stay strong and I need to be strong for obviously when the baby is here, and that will help my recovery, which I'll never know if it did or not because I don't know the opposite, right? So therefore, when it came to imagining my birth and thinking about what pre-labor and labor was going to be like, I had this whole idea that I would be really active, and I had been sitting on my exercise ball for a lot of my pregnancy. So I'd been doing the hip sways, I'd been sitting on it to try and, help with the positioning. I'd been doing a lot of pelvic movements and so on, right? And so therefore I thought, well, when it came to the birth, that will definitely be something that I will use. And it was really funny because when it came to the actual birth, I was not active at all. Like, I knew all the principles of using gravity and being active and moving and helping the descent of the baby and so on. And I just didn't want to do any of it. It was hilarious. So anyway, just as a side note, that's how I imagined my birth. Obviously, because of my bias as an exercise physiologist, I was thinking I'd be super active and I'd be moving, swaying, rocking, and so on. And I didn't. There you go. Imagining my birth, I wanted a vaginal hospital birth with little to no intervention, probably more towards the no interventions, but if there had to be any, as minimal as possible. I was wanting to try and have a drug-free birth. So try and birth without any drugs. I knew of pharmacological and pain reliefs. So I had asked my midwife what an epidural was. I don't think actually thinking of the epidural, and this is something I mentioned in another episode, I actually did not understand the package, so to speak, that the epidural comes with. So I had asked what happens during the epidural. So in terms of, the needle goes in your back, and I had asked, where in your back does it go? Because I knew of the spinal cord and so on. And I didn't want to be paralyzed. And so then I had asked, well, what happens after they put the needle and so on. But I actually never asked, and I didn't know to ask, and it was never mentioned about the fact that when you get an epidural, you also get a catheter put in to drain your urine, because you're not able to potentially feel that the bladder is full and therefore empty it. And you also get a drip as well, which potentially they also augment your labor. So therefore, again, something I didn't know and I didn't ask. And there you go, lack of information there. So I knew of the epidural, I knew of the gas. I knew the gas was, for the most part, what I heard about the gas was it made me feel really nauseous, but for some women it worked, so I was sort of open to that. The epidural was a very last resort thing. I knew morphine was an option, but it didn't sound like it was a common option, so it sounded like it was more if you have a really difficult labor, potentially a back labor and so on, so it didn't really seem to be a thing. And then I knew of sterile water injections as well, which again sounded like it was more for back labors, and it didn't sound like it was something they did very often either at the hospital. That was pretty much the options I was given, and then I was basically told to stay at home for as long as possible during your labor, and then come into hospital when you really feel like you can't take it, or potentially something's happened, like your waters have broken and they're colored potentially, or there is maybe a bit of blood, or there's reduced movements or something like that, right? So I was happy with that because I wanted to stay at home for as long as possible. I wanted to not have anyone touch me, tell me things, whatever. I wanted to be in hospital for the least amount of time I could be. So that was perfect for me. In terms of my third trimester, it was amazing. I didn't have any aches or pains at any point. I didn't feel huge. I felt big. I mean, I went to 40 weeks, so I felt pretty big, but I didn't feel like I could still, get off the couch and stuff. I had a little bit of problem putting my shoes on. The belly got in the way. But other than that, I was really mobile. No aches, no pains. I could have been pregnant until 42, 43 weeks pretty much. So no, I was fine there. And there was something really funny about, so you can have your baby, your baby's considered full-term from 37 weeks. And when I hit 37 weeks, I feel like I was almost anticipating to go into labor on that day, on that specific 37 weeks day. And it didn't happen. And so therefore, I got really disappointed. I got really down. Like, I had heard of women that get really frustrated and they get really impatient, especially as they get towards their due date or even past their due date, right? And by the way, I don't like the term due date, but obviously that is how the hospital puts it. You have an estimated due date. As a side note, in terms of my due date, I only told my actual due date to our close family, and that was it. Even to my friends, I never said when my actual due date was. I would say whether it was towards the start, the middle, or the end of the month. That was about it. Just because I didn't want people to be messaging and saying, have you given birth yet? So that was how I went about it, and that was helping, or almost, I mean, it didn't work, but the aim was to try and reduce the stress around this one particular date that, someone had decided that I was due on this one particular day in the month. I now talk about due month. I prefer the term due month because pretty much, you can be from your due date, you can be due with air quotes 3 weeks before that date or 2 weeks after, really. So you've almost got 2 months there. So I talk about a due month, really. When it came to 37 weeks, I was fully expecting to have the baby on that day. So it didn't happen, and mentally I hit a wall on that day. And that was something I wasn't prepared for. So I'm putting it out there just so to say that, mentally I was doing perfectly fine. And then 37 weeks came, I didn't go into labor, and I hit a wall. That was terrible. And from there on, it was really difficult because I both wanted my baby to stay in, to be as matured and the lungs maturing and to be as big as she could be. We didn't know the gender back then again. So in this episode, if you hear me say she before the birth, we had no idea that it was a girl. We didn't find out by choice. We wanted the surprise at birth and we got it. So at the time we didn't know, but she was a girl. One of the reasons why we didn't find out, just as a side note, is I love surprises to start with. So does my partner, Jason. And also it didn't matter. The gender of the baby did not matter. There was no need for us. We didn't need to know the gender to imagine ourselves with the baby. We knew that it was a baby and the gender was irrelevant to us. So anyway, there you go. So then the pregnancy unfolded. So 37 weeks went by and passed, 38 weeks, 39 weeks. And I think at 38 weeks, I lost my mucus plug. So I thought, wow, okay, cool, 38 weeks, great, I'm going to go into labor now. And I was still working, by the way. So I worked until 39 and a half weeks, only because I wanted to and because I didn't want to be at home doing nothing. So there was that thing where I had this feeling, I had this thought that if I'm at home and I'm on maternity leave, essentially before the baby comes, well, I'm not contributing to society. I'm not contributing to the household. So I'm basically lazy. So I didn't want to be lazy, and I felt really good as well. That obviously helps. I didn't feel like I needed a break, and I didn't feel like I needed to rest, even though my midwife kept telling me to rest, but I just don't rest. I don't nap. This is not something I'm not able to nap through the day because the sun's out. My body knows. So it's not time to sleep for me. So therefore, I didn't feel tired. That was a good thing for me. I didn't feel tired. So I worked until 39 and a half weeks. And I think this is part of the reason why I didn't go into labor before then, because I think subconsciously I wasn't finished working. So I had put out the date of my maternity leave as close to my due date, air quotes, as possible, because I didn't want to be at home bored and waiting for 2 or 3 weeks. I had put it as close to that date as I could, but then there was a point where I kind of needed to tell my work when I was finishing, and I kind of needed to be finished too, I kind of needed to wrap things up. I think subconsciously, because I knew the day that I was finishing, I feel like somehow, and this is a theory I have, right? I'll never be able to prove if it's right or wrong. I feel like this inhibited the start of my labor. Maybe not, who knows. So at 38 weeks, I lost my mucus plug. Nothing happened. At 39 weeks, a week later, I lost my mucus plug again. Nothing happened. And I was getting really frustrated by then, because even though this whole pregnancy, I was like, I'm not going to get bogged down into the whole 40 weeks being overdue. I'm not going to buy into it. I'm going to be stronger than that. When I came to 40 weeks, there was no pressure yet from the hospital, but I could feel it. I could feel it coming. I was anticipating it. So therefore, I was stressing myself out, basically. 39 weeks, nothing happened. 40 weeks. I got to 40 weeks and nothing happened. I think I lost my mucus plug on that day, and I was so disappointed because I was so sure on the actual due date I would go into labor now. Well, I didn't. Nothing happened. And to my knowledge, I never had Braxton Hicks. I never felt any contractions. I never had any signs. So I was like, well, okay, it's just not happening. So I wasn't sure if I'd ever do a stretch and sweep. This was something where I researched it. I knew what it was, but I wasn't sure if I ever wanted one. So when 40 weeks came by, mentally, I think I was putting the pressure on myself to go into labor soon so that the hospital wouldn't pressure me. So therefore, I decided to get a stretch and sweep at 40+1. That wasn't too bad of an experience. What it really was good for, from my perspective and in my experience, was it gave me the reassurance that my cervix was open. So I was 1 and a bit centimeter dilated already. And my midwife said that my baby's position was really good and she could also feel my waters. So she was basically telling me that the baby was pretty much in an optimal position. My cervix was already starting to dilate. So I knew then that my body was actually doing something that I didn't know it was doing. So that really helped me to give me a lift, to go, okay, there's something happening. I didn't know about it, but now I know. So, okay, my body is actually doing something. It can birth. Okay, great. So then, I got the pickup I needed. 40+2, nothing happened. And then 40+3. So on that day, I was meant to get a second stretch and sweep. My midwife said, I'll give you another one in 48 hours if you want. And I was like, oh, okay, sure. I mean, the first one wasn't too bad. And I was like, okay, well, I mean, she was going to come to my house and just check my blood pressure, check the baby and so on, and then I would decide on at that point if I wanted one or not. So on that morning, so 40+3 I woke up in the middle of the night and I felt like, I don't know if I felt like I was having cramps, but I felt like I needed to go to the toilet. So I went to the toilet, emptied my bladder, and then I was like, okay, I think maybe I'm getting cramps. But I think in my head, because I had been waiting since 37 weeks to go into labor, at this point I'm in total disbelief, right? So I'm not even really sure if I know that I'm having cramps, if that even makes any sense, what I'm saying. It was 1:30 in the morning, and somehow this was the only night where every other night we'd gone to bed early. This was the only night where we didn't go to bed early. We went to bed at 11, whereas we'd usually go to bed like 9:30 or 10, or even 9, because I had been really exhausted in the days and weeks before that point. And I remember that some nights I was in bed by 9 because I was just really tired. And I was like, I don't even want to watch TV because I'm too exhausted. Only night where I go to bed at 11, I went into labor the next day. What are the chances, right? So I wake up at 1:30 and I've gone to the toilet because I was thinking, well, maybe it was my bladder. Anyway, it's empty now. And so then I try and go back to sleep. And I can't go back to sleep. I'm kind of a bit, like, I'm not in pain, but I'm just like, there's something preventing me. It's a little bit uncomfortable. So I wake up Jason and I go, oh, Jason, I think we need to time these. And he's like, nah, I don't think so. And he's thinking, you're in early labor, if anything. We don't need to time them. So I'm like, okay, so I go, oh, okay, maybe not. But then 10 minutes later, or, whatever time it was later, I'm like, no, I think we need to time them. So then he wakes up, and that's how unprepared we were. We didn't even have a timing app on the phone, right? So it's like 1:45 in the morning, and he's downloading a timing app on the Play Store. So we download it, and then we start timing. And somehow my now contractions that I didn't know there were contractions at the time are actually 5 minutes apart. And they're extremely regular. We kind of wait because my midwife had said, oh, call me when it's been, they've been this hard, this frequently, and so on, right? So I kind of wait. But then I'm like, well, I kind of need to let her know because I remembered that she had told me 2 days before that she was due to go, potentially to go for an induction birth on that day, actually. And so I was thinking, oh, I need to let her know because I don't know if that induction is happening in the morning, or if it's happening later, or if it's still happening, I don't know, because that induction was at a different hospital to the one that I was meant to birth at. So therefore I was like, oh, I need to tell her, because, well, maybe she's going to go for that one, and so therefore she needs to find me another midwife, right? So at this point I was fully accepting of the fact that she probably wouldn't be at my birth, because she had told me that she had to go to this induction birth. So I call her, and I think in the spirit of me being me, I kind of downplayed it, right? So I called her and I'm kind of like, oh yeah, look, I'm all right, like, I don't know why. I don't know why I had to downplay it. I had to be like I wasn't in a lot of pain, but I mean, I was starting to get a little bit uncomfortable, right? But I made it sound like there was no pain at all, right? Or there was no uncomfortableness. It was all perfect roses and stuff, right? So she said, oh, well, that's okay. It sounds like you're in pre-labor. It can go on, obviously it can go on for a while. So, just try and rest, be active, take a shower if you feel the need to, and so on, right? So I'm like, okay, cool. So then I hang up. And pretty much straight away, things just started to ramp up. At this point, I can't sleep, because my plan was to try and sleep for as much of the labor as I could, if I could, right? Especially because we hadn't slept much yet. So at this point I can't sleep. So I get up, and then I think I didn't know what to do. Even though I had this grand plan of what I would do in pre-labor, somehow when it was happening, I didn't know what I wanted, right? So I was a little bit lost there. I sat on my exercise ball, and that didn't feel comfortable. It just didn't feel right for me. I tried to take a shower, and that was no good. I didn't like it at all. It was so uncomfortable. So the only thing I found comfortable was to sit down and do nothing, and not be active. And I just want to put it out there that if you're like me and you have grand plans, and you know the theory of being active, being upright, squatting, and helping to open up the pelvis, and helping with the descent of the baby, and you just know all of this, and you get to labor and you just want to sit down or lay down, and that's all you want to do, that's totally okay, because that is exactly what I've done, and that is all I wanted to do, and that is all I could do as well. It was good because I needed to get in my zone, obviously, to try and cope with this. So to me, being seated on the bed, I couldn't even have my back against the pillow and actually rest my back. I literally sat on the edge of the bed. I was half falling asleep, half in my zone. So when I wasn't having a contraction, I was going into a mini sleep at that point, and then I would wake up, breathe through the contractions, and then I would go back to sleep, essentially. I had heard it before, and I just couldn't imagine it, and then this is what happened to me. And so therefore I was like, wow, it is a real thing. Like, it's surreal to go into micro sleeps when you're in between contractions. It was totally blowing my mind, really. There came a point where I wanted to stay at home as long as possible, but there came a point where my contractions were 3 minutes apart. They were lasting 60 seconds, pretty much on average. And the hospital was a 25 to 30 minute drive, and I was calculating how many contractions I would have in the car, which I had always heard that the car ride when you're in labor is the most uncomfortable car ride in your life. And so therefore I was like, oh, I kind of want to stay home. I was somehow coping. I was in my zone. I was able to breathe through, those contractions. But then at the same time, well, I kind of didn't want to leave it too late and not be able to cope with the 25 to 30 minute drive. So therefore, I think at that point I had been in pre-labor / labor for about 5 hours, 5 to 6. And basically at that point I decided that I thought it was the right time to start getting in the car and to start going to the hospital, because I felt like it was the right time. And I know my midwife had told me, you'll know when to go to hospital. And I was like, but how am I going to know? But yeah, it's right. At that point, I remember going, we need to start this process now, because otherwise I'm not sure what's next. And then I'm just not sure I'll even be able to get myself in the car, right? So anyway, we made our way, out, we got into the car. The car ride was actually not too bad. I was still in my zone. I was still able to breathe through and use breathing techniques, and that seemed to be fine. The car ride actually went a lot faster than I thought, so I had my eyes closed for most of the car ride, but I would open them at little intervals to kind of see where we were at. And I remember thinking, oh, okay, yeah, we're almost there. I just wanted to check that we were making it anytime soon, basically. So we made it to the hospital, and that's the funny part, where I was never told what to do when you get to hospital. I was just told you get to hospital and you go to the maternity ward, right? So when I get to hospital and I'm having contractions every 3 minutes, and from the car park to the entrance of the hospital, which is not that far, when I've already had 3 contractions, at that point, when I get to hospital, the last thing that's on my mind, and I didn't know you even had to, the last thing I'm thinking about is signing in, right? And getting the wristband. No, I just went straight down the hall and I went to maternity ward. And I remember the lady at the reception, she gave me a look of, where is she going? I think it was pretty obvious where I was going. I didn't stop, okay? I didn't have time for this. So I didn't know you had to sign in. I was never told this. So I don't know how I was meant to know. So I just walked straight to the maternity ward. And actually, I met my midwife on the way there. I had another 3 or 4 contractions in the hospital, and it's not a big one. It's a pretty straightforward path too. But anyway, I had so many contractions. I was just like, yeah, look, I'm at that point, I'm not even thinking I'm in labor. At that point, I think I'm in pre-labor, and I think this is going to go on for a long, long time. And this is really interesting because in my head, I had this clock in my head where I thought my labor was going to go on for 24 hours minimum. So in my head, I know what time my labor started at. I know what time it is now. And I know it hasn't been 24 hours. So therefore I'm like, oh, I've still got like something like 16 hours to go. Point of this story, don't be like me. Don't have a clock in your head of how long you think your labor should be. I don't know where I got that from. I do not know why. But anyway, so at this point I'm thinking I'm in pre-labor. Even though I'm getting contractions pretty much every 3 minutes, they're lasting 60 seconds. I'm breathing through them. It is a job and I'm exhausted because I haven't slept much and it's obviously a lot of work. So anyway, I get to the maternity ward and I sit on the bed, and then my midwife, she knew of my birth preferences. She knew how it was, obviously, and she was there. That's actually the most important point of this story is she ended up being there at my birth because her induction birth was scheduled for later that day, and she ended up being there at that birth too. So somehow she had 2 births in the space of like 24 hours, I think. That's probably insane for her. So my midwife met me, and she knew me, she knew how I was, she knew I was like super active and stuff. So then I sit on the bed and she's really good. She's trying to tell me, like, oh, do you want to do this? Do you want to go in the shower? Do you want to sit on the exercise ball? Do you want me to unroll, the mat? Do you want to be on all fours? And I'm like, no, I just want to sit on the bed. And I just sat on the bed and then I breathed through my contractions. And she had done an amazing job at setting up the room, actually. I remember that when I walked in the room, it was so good because she had turned the lights off and she had put, I think it was like a projector light, which projected little stars or something on the ceiling. I think there was a salt lamp on. And then obviously it's still a hospital room. Didn't feel like it was a hospital room, and she'd closed the curtains and stuff. Yeah, and so I remember that I really liked that. And then I sat on the bed. And then from there on, they say it's normal when you go to the hospital to feel like your labor is stalling because it's obviously a different environment. Even when the hospital, your midwife, it's obviously a very sterile and so on environment. And I definitely felt that. So when I got to the hospital, I felt I was still having contractions, but I definitely felt like my labor was stalling. I could feel that things were not progressing as quickly. It's kind of hard to explain because I was still having contractions. They were still regular. They were still intense, but somehow I could feel that something was slowing down inside of me. The other thing was I had been able to get in my zone, and sometimes I would kind of lose my zone when I was, in the car or at home, but then I would be able to get back into it. When I got to hospital, I definitely lost my zone there. I don't think I prepared enough for that change of environment, for that transition. But yeah, it was really hard for me to get back into it. So I had a lot of trouble there. From there on, it was a really difficult labor because I didn't have my zone and I started panicking. And obviously, when you do hypnobirthing, they tell you not to panic because that obviously that releases adrenaline and so on. I definitely had a lot of adrenaline going on because I was in a lot of pain at that point. Obviously, from there on, the hospital part was really difficult because I had lost my zone. I wasn't using my breathing techniques as well as I had been. I was probably producing way too much adrenaline and therefore I was in a lot of pain. And that was really hard, and mentally that was really hard, and I was exhausted. I definitely felt like I hit a wall at that point, like a really big wall, and all I wanted was the epidural. So I asked for the epidural from the time that I got into the birthing suite. And so in the birthing suite, it was just Jason and my midwife, and they both knew that I didn't want an epidural. I had my reasons for not wanting it. And so they kept reminding me of the reasons why I didn't want an epidural, which was I knew that and I could hear them. And then my midwife because I kept asking for the epidural, she would try and confirm whether I actually wanted one or whether I was just saying it because I'm in despair. Anyway, they ended up working out that I was in despair. Like, I wanted pain relief, but I knew I didn't want an epidural. So I kept going. And I changed position as well, which was difficult. I remember I was thinking, I can't move, I can't do anything. I had this very, I think, negative mindset of once I lost my zone, it was really hard from there on. And mentally and physically, I was exhausted. So changing position was like the hardest thing I had ever done in my entire life. But anyway, I changed position and that was really good. But then I started feeling like I needed to push. I didn't really have the urge to push, but I felt like I needed to push. And it ended up being that I had a cervical lip, and that was in the way. That was really bugging me because I could feel that I needed to push, but I didn't have the urge to push. And also, my waters had not released yet. And so I had the bag of water at the front that was kind of dangling down. And I could feel that there was something in the way, if that even makes any sense. And so I started to push, which I started to push too early, basically. But I felt like I had to push something out of the way. So I started to push, but it wasn't right because I wasn't actually pushing the baby. I was trying to push this thing that was in my way. So in amongst all of this, which almost sounds like chaos at this point, I was still thinking I was in pre-labor. Just to put it out there, because mentally I'm like, oh, this is going to go on for such a long time. I'm going to be pushing for like 6 hours and so on. So I wasn't in pre-labor. My midwife, actually, I didn't know if I wanted vaginal examinations. I had said, ask me the question on the day. I don't know if I want one or not. And on the day, I felt like I wanted to have one to, I think, check where I was up to. And so my midwife did one when I arrived, and I was happy for her to do it, obviously. And she didn't tell me what number I was at, right? And I think that was a good call because basically she told me later, when I arrived at the hospital, she thought I was in transition. So she's fully expecting me to be 7 to 8 centimeters, and I was 4. And then she did another vaginal examination. It was probably about maybe an hour and a half later, maybe, but I don't know about time at this point, right? At this point, I was in a real pit of despair. I couldn't do it. I kept saying, I can't do it. I need to sleep. I need the epidural. I want an epidural. I kept saying that, basically. That probably sounds like transition to a lot of people. So at that point, I was actually 8 to 9 centimeters, but she didn't tell me. And that's when I actually needed to know, because if I had known that I was that far into it, then I would have gone, oh, okay, I'm almost there. Even though we know that dilation is not a linear process and you can dilate 2 centimeters in 6 hours, just like you can dilate 2 centimeters in 30 minutes. But yeah, at that point, I would have needed to know, and she didn't tell me. So I thought, oh, I must be maybe still the same as I was, an hour and a half ago, or maybe I've even gone backwards. Who knows? And so I think during this time that I was 9, I think I was pushing at that point again for the reason that I was saying before. And so I think this is a part which is quite blurry. I don't think I remember it really, really well. But at some point, I kept pushing, and then my baby was born. Basically. And I remember when she was born, there was this instant relief. Like, obviously I felt the ring of fire before, and that was really super painful. And I think even then I'm thinking that birth is still going to go on for another however long, right? And then she's born, and I remember feeling this relief instantaneously of going, oh wow, it's over. And then I don't think I had any more pain in my body, right? I was like, oh, it's done. It's over. Wow. Basically, to summarize, because I think at that point, this is quite, you can probably tell that it's quite blurry in my head, and I'm trying to remember, but I'm actually not even sure of how, in what sequence things happened. At that point, I looked at the clock. Actually, I really wanted to check that someone knew what time my child was born at, so I checked the clock just as a side note. I remember thinking, I've done it. Like, I did it, I wanted a vaginal hospital birth with little to no intervention and hopefully with no drugs. And I'd done exactly that. And I had a very undisturbed birth. My midwife was there as a bystander. She would check, she would do Doppler checks during the labor. And she was really skilled in not making me move. She would just say, oh, are you happy for me to check the Doppler? And she would just squeeze herself in the space that I gave her, and she would do the Doppler check, and then things were fine. There was no alarming signs. So then she would just go back to doing what she was doing, which I don't know what she was doing exactly, but she was definitely a bystander. She was watching, and that was amazing. So I had a very undisturbed birth where Jason was my main support, and then my midwife was there to check that things were going fine, and she had some word of encouragement as well. But other than that, she didn't intervene. She didn't put any pressure on me. She didn't say, you've got to stop pushing, or you've got to start pushing, or, you've only got this time left. No, it was all so undisturbed. And then it was the same when it came to the placenta birth. So after my baby was born, the high of the birth was insane. I loved it. It was nothing that I have ever experienced, and nothing that I have experienced again yet. I remember being so high, and I was like, wow. for the next 3 hours, all I could say was, wow. That was so funny. And so we didn't know the gender of the baby. We didn't find out for another 10 minutes, I think, because we were just so happy that she was born. And I kept looking at her, wondering if she was a boy or a girl, and I couldn't tell from just her face. And it didn't matter, right? And so I was like, oh, I don't need to find out just yet. So we did skin to skin straight away. I got into a more comfortable position, and I think my midwife checked me at that point, and I had a 2nd-degree tear. And then she called the obstetrician to come and repair it, and I think he took probably a good hour to come anyway. And during that time, I was holding my daughter, which I didn't know was my daughter at that point, and that was it. There was no interference, there was no intervention, there was nothing. They didn't need to take her, they didn't need to weigh her, they didn't need to dress her. It was great. It was amazing. We tried to start breastfeeding, but she wasn't latching, and we found out later why. Because when she was born, she wasn't in the birth canal for a very long time, so she didn't get a lot of lung squeezes to get the fluid out. So she wasn't breastfeeding because basically she still had a lot of fluid in her stomach and so on. And so later on, she actually vomited. She brought up that fluid, and then she was able to latch better, but we didn't know that at the time. We found out she was a girl, and it was amazing. It was, I don't know, I was so high, and I still am thinking of it now. It was amazing. I thought thought she was a boy the whole time. And then at 38 weeks, I thought she was a girl. And then she was a girl. So then I was like, oh, I'm right. We stayed in hospital for 24 hours, I think. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go home or if I wanted to continue to get help with breastfeeding because it was a bit hit and miss. I had trouble to get a good latch and I wasn't sure if I was doing it right, and it was quite difficult. I found it quite hard. So yeah, I wasn't sure if I wanted to stay in hospital to get help. But thing is, when you're on the postpartum ward, they come very often to do, checks and to check the baby's temperature and so on. And it's kind of really disruptive. And so it was kind of like, I think I kind of wanted to be, at home because, well, then you're less disrupted. And there was no medical reason to stay. Everyone was fine. I had a physiological third stage as well. So I didn't have any syntocin to expel the placenta. I didn't have a big blood loss. So yeah, there was no medical reason to stay. So we went home, and because I was in the MGP, my midwife came to see us for the next 6 weeks. So she came pretty much weekly to come and check on us, to weigh the baby and to check that everything was all good and to, answer questions and so on. So that was really good because it was a transition and it was one that I didn't prepare for. I didn't prepare well for breastfeeding. I didn't do much. I did a bit of research, but I didn't know. It's hard to practice or to think about the positions when you haven't got the baby. Like, I need to practice to understand, and I obviously didn't have the baby to practice with. So I found it really hard to educate myself on breastfeeding, I think. So I didn't do a lot of breastfeeding education. Definitely that I should have done a bit more. That would have helped. I was lucky that once we got the hang of the latching and, position to breastfeeding, then things were pretty smooth sailing. So that was good. But I had a lot of pain, sensitivity, I should say, sensitivity around my nipples. That was really difficult. I felt like it was really difficult, and I wasn't prepared for it. Again, like, I had heard of it, I knew it was a thing. I didn't understand it'd be that degree of sensitivity. So yeah, that was quite difficult. And then mentally, the transition was actually quite difficult. Like, I had obviously wanted to be a mom for a long, long time, and I had wanted this baby for a long, long time. Well, I think I had definitely the baby blues. It was almost heading towards postpartum depression. But I think because my midwife was there and we were able to chat through, my feelings and how I felt, and like, I knew the thoughts I had were not that they were irrational, but like, I knew they didn't make sense, but I still had them. And it was difficult to have had such a good pregnancy. And, I obviously wanted all of this, and then I had it, and then all of a sudden I felt really sad. It was really difficult to comprehend and to understand. Even though I've worked in mental health, I don't know, I feel like I was immune to it somehow. So I think it's important to say that, yeah, in the first 6 weeks, I felt really sad, and I felt like I had this whole anxiety about time was passing too quickly. So, and then I think I had a lot of fear around my partner going back to work, because I was like, oh, I'm not sure how I'm going to go. Like, am I going to be able to look after this baby? I'm not sure. I wasn't sure how I was going to be looking after this baby on my own, right? With no one around, no one to say, oh, can you help with this? Or, am I doing this right? I felt like I couldn't do it on my own. So yeah, I had this whole, even though Jason had 6 weeks of work, I think, it felt like she was born and he was going back to work the next week pretty much. So yeah, there was a lot of anxiety there around time passing and him, I think, returning to work. I think if he wasn't returning to work, or if he was in a model where he was definitely, at home and he had really flexible hours, that would have been different. But it wasn't the case. So it was like, how am I going to go? But then, that subsided before he went back to work. And then obviously we took it day by day, right? Like, things were, obviously it was all new. You really sleep deprived initially. We took it day by day, and things, obviously I looked after her fine. I was fine on my own, but I don't know, somehow I felt like I couldn't do it initially, but then I did. So, who knows, right? Yeah. And so fast forward a little bit, I wasn't sure when we had her. I pretty much knew that I wanted a sibling. Well, actually, no, I wasn't sure I wanted to have another one, because I think a lot of parents to an only child will understand that, because the love you have for your child is so intense, consuming, that you feel like you wouldn't be able to give the same amount of love and attention to the next one. And the other thing was, I was thinking, oh, the next one will not get this one-on-one special time. Obviously, the attention would be divided between, our daughter and then this one. And so I thought, oh, that's quite unfair for the next one. And also, I didn't want to have my attention shift to another child for my daughter's sake as well. So initially, I wasn't sure if I wanted to have another one. But then as she got a little bit older, I think things fell into place, and I think I felt like, I feel like I want to have another one, right? And then we decided to start trying when I think she was 13 months old, and we got pregnant straight away. That was a shock. That was a total shock, because we had taken 10 months to conceive our daughter and we fell pregnant on the first go. And that was just about as shocking as taking 10 months was. So there you go. So very interesting journey, very different pregnancy, which if you want to listen to my pregnancy series, part 1, part 2, they're up there on the podcast. So I'm currently 31 weeks pregnant, and I will do a birth story after this one's born. We don't know the gender either of this one, so I don't know if it's a boy or a girl. And I will take you back through the whole pregnancy and the birth and so on, and what it's like to have 2 children, 2 under 2, as they say, because when this one is born, my daughter will be just about 22 months. So there will be 22 months age gap between them. Yeah, and so there you go. I will leave it there. Otherwise, it will be a very, very long episode, and I've already spoken about my first and second trimester. So heavily so on the podcast. I'll put the links in the show notes anyway. That was my birth story. Finally recorded it. I hope you got anything from it. Yeah, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for supporting this show. It means a lot to me to know that some people actually care about, what I have to say. So thank you so much, and hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you guys next week for a brand new episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to get notified of when a new episode comes out, please subscribe to this show on your podcast listening platform. Also, I would really appreciate it if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcast or share this episode so that other moms can find it. If you would like to tell your own pregnancy, birth, or parenting story, please head to the show notes and you will find a form there to get in touch with me. Again, thank you so much for listening, and I will be with you again next week for a new episode.